Retired from service in 1963, Wendell Stevens has since earned an international reputation as one of the world's foremost UFO investigators, having published well over 20 books on the subject. His interest in the phenomenon was established in 1947 when he was transferred to Alaska and placed in charge of B-29 crews flying missions over the Arctic.
When I got to Alaska, I found that my additional duty, I was assigned there as an assistant base operations officer, completely out of my specialty. My specialty was technical engineering. As an assistant base operations officer, and my additional duty was supervising a team of civilian technicians from Wright Field, where I had just come out of, that were installing special equipment aboard the B-29s that were flying their target profiles are over all the B-29 crews had their targets in Russia, and they carried them home with them. They had them with them all the time so they could get on an airplane in 5 minutes and have the targets with them. They were required to fly a profile mission on their targets over the Arctic in Arctic airspace and their Arctic conditions at least once, and every crew was rotated through Alaska to do this. My team was installing special equipment to look for anomalous aerial phenomena, is what the Russians were calling it. We were calling them flying saucers. We were looking for surges in the electrical system. We installed surge detectors in every system on the B-29. There's 5 or 6 different electrical systems. We installed magnetic detectors in the lines. We installed cameras in positions that didn't have, all the gun positions on the B-29 already had 16 millimeter cameras in them. But we installed other cameras that looked forward and looked aft. We had handheld cameras. We had even 35 millimeter movie cameras and a big 70 millimeter movie camera that could be used. And they also had a Fairchild 8x10 camera that was a big thing like this. It took a picture on an 8-inch by 10-inch negative. So all of that stuff was carried aboard the airplane, and after the operation people briefed the crews, then after the weather people briefed the crews, then the Coast and Geodetic Survey people briefed the crews, then I had to brief the crews on the equipment that my team had put aboard and how to use it and what it was for. And if they got anything when they came back, they were debriefed in the same order. And if they had experienced anything, they'd be turned over to me last, and they'd tell me what they experienced one by one. And while they were doing that, my crews would be downloading the cartridges, cassettes, and film cans, and all of those things we had. And if they had had an experience of any kind that was unique and important, the data would all be boxed in a metal box looked like a little footlocker, about that long and about that wide and about that high. And that was padlocked on a lieutenant's wrist and flown out to Washington every night on a courier. And he had to go to a certain office that had a key to take it off to unlock him and turn him loose. And they kept the box and sent it back on the next courier flight. We had several of those, and this was how the data was transmitted to Washington. We never had no way to read it. We couldn't develop that. We could, but they weren't allowed to develop the film, to read the tapes, to look at the movie camera film. Nothing.
But you were hearing stories.
Well, we'd hear the stories that resulted from the action that was on the film, but we never got to see any of it. So there were some real interesting stories about seeing objects sitting on the water, submerge and disappear as the B-29 came along. Other times they'd take off and fly away. Once was seen to come to the surface and emerge and fly away. They saw them take off from the ice surface of the ice pack up there, the snowfield. And these are big objects, 100 feet in diameter, that have no ground support equipment. You know, to get a B-29 airborne in the Arctic in the wintertime, it takes a field of equipment around the B-29 as big as the B-29. Well, here were bigger craft sitting on the snow up there with no ground support equipment that take off and fly away at high speed. And that puzzled our senior leaders a good deal, because they wanted to believe that it was a Russian innovation that had come out of the war, that they didn't want to accept the idea that it might be extraterrestrial. In fact, I was almost alone in that idea. Most of the time, I'd tell my boss that I thought they were extraterrestrial beings, and he'd laugh and he'd say, "They can't come here from there and go back. Why would they come?" Because cosmic distances are too vast. You know, if it's going to take you 50 years to get someplace and 50 years to get home, who's going?
With me is author and filmmaker Robert Emenegger.
and former security manager and chief of requirements for the audiovisual program at Norton Air Force Base, Paul Schartle. Gentlemen, Mr. Emmenegger, how did you get involved with UFOs?
Well, it was in 1973 when I was vice president at Gray Advertising, and I took time out and went to Norton Air Force Base to explore subjects for television specials related to the Defense Department. While discussing several of the subjects, UFOs came up, and Paul here told us about a film of a landing of alien crafts at Holloman Air Force Base about 3 years earlier.
What did you see, Mr. Schartle?
I saw footage of 3 dish-shaped crafts. One of the craft landed and 2 of them went away.
Why did it land?
It appeared to be in trouble because it oscillated all the way down to the ground. However, it did land on 3 pods. A sliding door opened, a ramp was extended, and out came 3 aliens.
What did they look like?
Well, they were human-sized. They had odd gray complexion and a pronounced nose. They wore tight-fitting jumpsuits, thin headdresses that appeared to be communication devices, and in their hands, they held a translator, I was told. A Holloman base commander and other Air Force officers went out to meet them.
You actually saw these aliens on the film?
Yes.
This film footage sounded very, very special, and we wanted to use it as the ending of our television special.
And did you? Was it in your special?
Well, although the Pentagon had been very, very cooperative all the way, at the last minute, the film was confiscated, and we lost the whole finale of our show. But what I saw and heard was enough to convince me that, the phenomenon of UFOs is real, very real.
Mr. Schartle, what did your superior officers tell you?
I was told it was theatrical footage the Air Force has purchased to make a training film.
Well, that sounds plausible, doesn't it?
Well, if it were a theatrical film, why didn't I have a record of this? It was my job to keep accurate records of all audiovisual purchases.
Is there any other reason that you feel this was not a theatrical film?
Yes, it was too real. The people who were shooting that day were Air Force personnel. Lucky for us, the day they were shooting, they were doing an acceleration test.
Yeah, well, it's too bad we couldn't get that footage from the Air Force.
6 years later, Cooper again encountered a UFO. This one definitely was not a weather balloon. While supervising flight testing at Edwards Air Force Base, his military camera crew actually filmed an unidentified saucer-shaped object landing near the site.
As they were sitting there filming, a little saucer came from, I say little saucer, it was a saucer, came flying over their heads, put down 3 little landing gear and landed right out on the dry lake bed. And they picked up their cameras and started over toward it, filming as they went. And when they got in fairly close to it, it lifted up, put the gear back in the wheel wells, tipped up, and took off at a great rate of speed. And so they came into my office and told me what had happened, and I sent them over to develop the film, and then had to go through all the proper regulations of reporting this, and we wound up having to send the film forward to Washington in the base jet airplane, and I don't know whether anyone's ever seen it since.
Now, the vehicle that you just described, how similar was it to the very first sighting that you had back in 1951?
Quite similar. It was basically the same planform vehicle. They were double saucer, lenticular. But if you're going to be going in and out of atmospheres like Earth or other places might have, you certainly need a little more aerodynamic type of vehicle. And the saucer has the capability of going through the air at tremendous rates of speed and handling the bow and trailing wave without making shock waves. So it can be very silent while traveling at big rates of speed through the atmosphere.
We'd just come out of the most destructive war on the face of the planet, World War II, 50 million dead. We had just barely gotten beyond that, and suddenly, according to documents, there were mysterious objects maneuvering in American airspace.
UFO researcher and lecturer Robert Hastings has spent 22 years studying the United States' interest in and reaction to reports of UFOs. Hastings has concluded that not only is the government fooling the American public, they've been fooling themselves.
I think it's not a coincidence that the phenomenon has accelerated its activity precisely at a time in human history when we've acquired nuclear weapons. I have interviewed 21 former and retired Air Force personnel associated with nuclear missile squadrons who have referred to incidents involving the presence of flying saucers.
That theory is based in part on the personal experiences of Robert Jacobs, a former Air Force lieutenant. In 1964, Lieutenant Jacobs claims he sat in a room at Vandenberg Air Force Base and saw a UFO that haunts him to this day.
Hair's going up on the back of my neck right now thinking about it, just remembering that day. I saw something that was so strange that it changed my life. It changed the way I believe about the universe and my place in it and our place in it.
In 1964, Lieutenant Robert Jacobs was stationed at Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. He was in charge of a special photographic unit filming test flights of Atlas F and Minuteman missiles, both nuclear weapon delivery systems.
When you launch a piece of equipment that costs $4 or $5 million just for the piece of equipment and it blows up 300 yards out of the hole, we want to know, first of all, why did it blow up? So my job was to provide photographic documentation from 30 or 40 different camera positions for each launch.
In November of 1964, Jacobs was assigned to film a Vandenberg missile launch using a brand new state-of-the-art telescope developed at Boston University. It was the most powerful lens the Air Force had ever used.
The biggest lens we had on our M45s was 180 inches. This telescope had an effective focal length of 1,200 inches, so you can see that it's enormously bigger. It was so big, in fact, that when the missile left Vandenberg with the Boston University telescope, in one single frame, just the bottom 3 engines on an Atlas F filled the frame. That was from a distance of about 130 nautical miles.
In a top-secret mission, the telescope was flown in from Boston aboard a Hercules aircraft. This is actual footage shot by Jacobs' unit and only recently rediscovered in his archive. The telescope was so large, it had to be hauled to its site in an 18-wheel big rig. Jacobs' crew assisted the telescope's inventor, Walter Manning, with the installation of the lens. The camera was perched on a bluff in Big Sur, 130 miles from the launch site.
We walked onto the missile and we saw all 3 stages of powered flight. Through our binoculars, we could see that happen.
It was a test of a top-secret anti-missile missile, one designed to confuse enemy missiles and then go on to hit its target. The camera was programmed to follow the missile automatically and run for 6 minutes, long past the point where the missile was visible.
Now, what we didn't know is what else we had got besides the missile.
After the film was developed, Project Director Major Florenz Mansman called Jacobs into his office, and Major Mansman was not alone.
There were 2 guys in gray suits in there. Civilian clothes. They were not in the Air Force. They were from somewhere else. They never identified themselves. They could have been CIA, OSI, OSS.
Jacobs was asked to watch his test film in the presence of these mysterious officials.
The nose cone spread out. The warhead was quite plainly visible. Something flew into the frame. What I saw was a circular object. It was a classic flying saucer. And it shot a beam of something at our warhead. You have to imagine this thing is flying along at several thousand miles an hour. This stuff is flying along, and something comes into the frame and chasing it, and comes in like this and fires at it, and goes around like this and fires at it, and goes around like this and fires at it, and fires at it like this, and then goes back out that way. What the hell could do that?
That was exactly what Major Mansman wanted to know.
And he said, "What was that?" And I said, "It looks to me like we got a UFO." And he said, "You are never to say that again. As far as you're concerned, Lieutenant Jacobs, this never happened." And I was sworn to silence, reminded of the severity of a security breach, and told to leave the room. 18 years went by with that image in my mind.
After 18 years of silence, Jacobs felt compelled to go public. When he did, the official Air Force response was astonishing.
The Air Force denied that I was ever there. There was no Lieutenant Robert M. Jacobs in the Air Force at that time. I was never at Vandenberg Air Force Base. If I was at Vandenberg Air Force Base, I was never in charge of the photo-optical instrumentation section at the 1369th Photographic Squadron, right here at this base. They denied then that there was a tracking site at Big Sur. They denied that there was a telescope called the BU telescope. They denied that there was a Dr. Walter Manning. They denied everything.
However, Sightings has obtained documents that prove he was in the Air Force in 1964 and that he was in charge of the photo-optical instrumentation site at Big Sur. In a letter to Sightings, Florenz Mansman, Lieutenant Jacobs' direct superior and the man present when the infamous UFO footage was screened, says, quote, "I am writing to confirm Dr. Jacobs' account as he had described it." But by far, The most compelling evidence is this film, which proves the existence of an event the Air Force continues to deny.
The Air Force is probably not going to like this film, but there's nothing they can do about it. It exists. It documents the telescope, the people who were there, including me. And if there are any ramifications about it, I guess I just don't care anymore.
My name is Donna Hare, and I worked at Philco Ford Aerospace from 1967 to 1981. During that time, I was a design illustrator, draftsman. I did the launch slides and landing slides, and also projection plotting boards, lunar maps for NASA. We were a contractor, but most of the time I worked on site, in Building 8. I had the opportunity to do extra work during downtime, which was between missions, and I walked into a photo lab, which was the NASA lab, across the hallway. I had a secret clearance, which is not that high, but I was able to go into restricted areas, which this was. At the time, I was talking to one of the techs in there, and he drew my attention to a photograph, a NASA photograph. It had a dot on it. And I said, what is that? Well, he drew my attention to it, and I said, is that a dot on the emulsion? And he said, and he's smiling, and he has his hands crossed, and he said, round dots on the emulsion don't leave round shadows on the ground. And this was an aerial photograph of the Earth, I'm assuming the Earth, because it had pine trees on it, and the shadows of the craft, or whatever it was, were in the same angle as the trees. And by its very nature, UFO, and I wanted to clarify that to a gentleman that was talking to me, means unidentified. So I did not know what this was. But I realized at this point that it's very secret, that it was kept secret, because I asked him, what are you going to do with this piece of information? And he said, we always airbrush these out before we sell them to the public. So they're pesky little creatures appearing on this photograph they wanted to get rid of. After that, I decided I would ask questions to other people that work there. And I found that I had to ask them away from the site and not on site. A guard told me that he was asked to burn some photographs and not to look at them. And there was another guard guarding him, who was in green fatigues, watching him burn the photographs. And he said he was too tempted. He looked at one, and it was a picture of a UFO, and he was very descriptive. I can go into that later with anyone. He immediately was hit in the head, and he had a big gash in his forehead. He was knocked out, and he's terrified, so he would have to be protected. Another incident, I knew someone in quarantine with the Apollo astronauts. He told me that the Apollo astronauts saw craft on the moon when we landed, and that is what he told me. And he also was afraid. He said that the astronauts are told to keep this quiet. They're not allowed to talk about it. So I do want to let you know that I worked out there for a number of years, and I ran into this. So it's not something everyone knows that works out there for a long time. My boss didn't know about it. Some people that sat right next to me didn't know about it. It's very strange, because I don't know how they can do it, but they can let some people know about it and then others not. I'm willing to testify before Congress that what I'm saying is true, and thank you very much.
As far as I'm concerned, it may sound circumstantial to some, but as far as I'm concerned, it's proven. As part of the disclosure project, there was Donna Hare, and as a photographic scientist who had up to secret clearance, was in Building 8 of Johnson Space Center, she says in her testimony. And that one of her colleagues was doing some photographic work, invited her over to look at it. And she saw high-res satellite imagery, maybe 0.5 above treetops. I think it was like a white disc. And she at first thought, it's a blob in the emulsion, some kind of fault with the photographic process. And he said, well, look, blobs in the emulsion don't have perfectly formed shadows going in the same direction as the trees, etc., etc. All the detail was there. And she basically was saying that they had this whole place in Building 8 for airbrushing out UFOs on a regular basis, because they then, sell on their imagery to universities and the like. And having been all over other NASA installations already, I assumed the blank password scanning method would work the same in Johnson Space Center, and it did. Once I was in there, I used various network commands to strip out the machines that were in Building 8, and got onto those. And the very first one I was on literally had what she said. I can't remember if it was filtered and raw, processed and unprocessed. But there was definitely folders whereby there was a transformation in the data taking place between one and the other. These folders were full of images in a proprietary NASA format, or in a format I'd never seen before, no JPEGs or GIFs. They're also 200 to 300 megabytes in size, and being on a 56k dial-up modem, there's no way I was going to download it. It's like 5 minutes per megabyte. So what I did, the remote control program that gives you graphical control of the machine, turned the resolution right down, turned it down to I think 4-bit color. And then on the desktop of the NAS machine, navigated to the folder, double-clicked on the first image. The application launches, the image comes up on the screen, but it's still very, very slow. And what I saw, I was hoping to see exactly what she was describing, saucers and very definite imagery. And what instead I saw was, I assume it was the Earth. This was in sort of shades of grey, but you had the Earth's hemisphere, filling about 2/3 of the screen. And then halfway between the top of the hemisphere and the bottom of the picture, there was a classic sort of cigar-shaped object, but with the sort of golf ball domes, geodetic domes, above, below, and this side, and I assume the other side as well, so to the left and right as well. And with very slightly flattened cigar ends. No seams, no rivets, no sort of telemetry or antennae or anything like that. And it just had a feeling of not being man-made. There was none of the sort of signs of manufacture.
So in essence, it was a craft, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
And
when I first saw the top half of it, I thought, oh, well, it's a boring satellite picture or something. But as more of the thing was revealed, it was obvious it wasn't like any satellite I'd ever seen.
Wow.
And I've been space mad since I was about 14, so I've seen lots of pictures of satellites.
Okay, so you knew what you were looking at to some degree.
I have a Panasonic camera that has the ability to take photographs. It has a ability to take videos, obviously. When we got to this high point, I was taking video camera, and I had actually turned to the north, which just kind of slopes down. And right there was something that stuck out like a sore thumb, especially with jungle terrain, things like that. Vegetation, very green stuff, was something that stuck out so well. It's always going to be basically imprisoned in my mind for the rest of my life, and it has been for 14 years, was something that was rotating, and it was transitioning between colors like a light matte gray, as well as a dark matte black. So in between, that's what it kept, and it was very smooth. We had all looked at each other as we got online, and we decided to investigate. The further thing I want to say is that I actually took pictures and video of this before we actually trucked down. We had a dump pouch where we basically, if we expend ammunition, we want to retain our magazines, so we put those there. So I dropped my camera in there, and we decided to go down. We didn't have any communications, which was weird, and that was a very odd thing, and it's something that either could have been good that we didn't, or it could have been something that could have been very bad. And it just however you want to look at that. Once we got down this slope, we were approximately 150 meters away from this craft. When we all got to the point where we could see it, just like behind here, again, Mr. Schratt, phenomenal job. You can see that the craft here actually was roughly about 300 feet. And the reason why I know this is because you could fit 3 of the helicopters that we flew in on underneath this craft. It was rotating a clockwise motion. The panels here that you see, the black ones, at least 3 of them, was like a Vanta black, very dark. I have no idea what that was. On the very top, there was like a pyramid structure that you could see the shadowing of it, which would elicit that was a pyramid structure. And it had an audible hum to it, kind of like a guitar amp if you were to unplug that, or like a transformer. It's very audible. If I was to hear that sound again, I could tell you, okay, it's probably this thing or something similar to that. It's very distinct. And the way that it was floating, which was about 15, 20 feet off the ground, it was kind of a very eerie thing to see because I've never seen anything like that in my life. As I got up there, like I said, I was going back and forth. These guys are still searching our stuff. They're still, pointing their weapons at us. And after the last 2 trucks that I saw that actually got into that platform unloaded, they had 4 guys in each truck that would unload everything. However they did it, I can't tell you because, again, I was focused on this as well. And these trucks drove off. As that happened, this platform actually rose up off the ground itself. The top part of the craft actually met it down in the middle like this, and it formed into one solid piece. It floated right above the tree line. As soon as it was able to break that tree line, It actually had on the corners of each of these, which was an octagonal shape craft, by the way, on each corner it emanated a light. It was either red, yellow, green, or blue. Only those 4 colors I can distinctly remember. It didn't make any additional high-pitched sounds when it rose up. Once it got past that tree line, it shot over to the left, basically where the ocean was, at so fast, I would estimate probably 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles an hour instantaneous like that. There was no rotor wash, no exhaust that would disturb the trees, vegetation. The coconuts that were on these trees were not even touched. It produced no sonic boom. This thing was so fast. So as we're going to go ahead and fast track to a couple days later, which we end up in Subic Bay, which is like the party town in the Philippines. So we had 3 days there of liberty. The first night I come back, because we had to report back to the ship each night, we were not allowed to stay out in town. My rack was on my camera was on my rack, and the memory card that was in it was out, and my battery was out of the camera, missing as well. So all of that was missing. The only thing that was there was the camera. Mind you, I had my locker secured. I had other stuff that was basically piled on top of that camera. So whoever did it knew what the hell happened. So after that, the other thing that was also notable with that was each of the Marines that were with me also had their cell phones taken that they brought. Even though they didn't bring them on the mission, all their stuff was missing. The other stuff, the other people in the actual platoon never had their stuff touched. It was only us 6 that were affected. So fast tracking back when we returned back to Okinawa, one day I had got a call from the duty that was in the barracks. Each barracks has like a duty of Marines that are, making sure there's still order, things like that. He had been told that I needed to go up to the CP, so he informed me, so I had hightailed it up there. And oddly enough, there was nobody in the building, except for one gentleman who was wearing Air Force dress blues that was missing a name tag, which I understand in Air Force policy or regulations that they were supposed to wear a name tag, and he did not have that. I gave him the proper greeting of the day, gave him the salute. He had pulled me into an office, and he had said, "You are not allowed to tell anybody in your chain of command. I don't care if it's a general. I don't care if it's anybody. You are not allowed to talk about what happened. You can go to prison for this, or you could be killed." So he slid over a non-disclosure agreement, and it had 2 things that I can recall to this day as I quickly skimmed through it, because again, I had thought we were going to forget about this whole mess. And one was said TSSCI, and the other said Indonesia. There's only 2 things I can recall out of that. So I was forced to sign that. I signed it, and I had got the hell out of there as quick as I could. Before I did that, I tried to ask him who he was, and he would not tell me who he was. So I hightailed it back, and I have not spoken about it ever since I was able to recently, because what the law passed. But that is my account for you guys. This is also an urging for anybody in Washington, D.C. who's a political figure. Please get this under control, because there are people who are either being hurt or killed by this, and it's something that needs to be addressed. Please.
Today, Rex Heflin is living outside of San Francisco, and when I found him, he had a story he wanted told. A story that began as just another day on the job and turned into something historic.
Investigating traffic conditions. I was checking the area, and tree limbs had grown over some of the warning signs.
It all started early in the afternoon of August 3rd, 1965. Rex Heflin was working as a traffic investigator back then, on assignment near El Toro Air Force Base in Orange County, California.
I had the camera ready because I wanted to photograph of these trees and the obstruction.
That's when he noticed something in the sky.
I knew it was something different. It was not definitely not a helicopter or an aircraft as we know them. And it didn't seem to have too much altitude, and it crossed over in front of me, and I picked up the camera and took the first picture at that point. And it continued to hover in a slow motion to the right side, where I got 2 more pictures.
Rex made copies of the photos and shared them with friends. As word spread, a local newspaper did a story on the photos. The story drew the attention of top-secret military officials. These days, we call them Men in Black.
The people who identified themselves as being from NORAD came.
The men asked for Rex's original Polaroids. They didn't know he'd made copies.
But they sort of demanded them. And so I let them have the pictures. I thought, why not?
In the meantime, Rex also made history in a different way, when the photos reached a wide, young audience.
And when the Encyclopedia Britannica yearbook came out in '66, they published a photo of it, and they classified it under spacecraft.
But the originals themselves, they were gone for 28 years. Until one afternoon not long ago, when they showed up in Rex Heflin's mailbox.
They were supposed to have been stolen or kept by the Air Force, and to have them reappear now is quite a surprise. In fact, it raises questions. Why would it have come back? Who did bring it back?
The phone rang, and there was a lady's voice on the phone advising me to check my mailbox. And I checked the mailbox, and there was a small tan or manila mailing type envelope in there, and with my name on it, and it had those photos in it. There was no postage. It was delivered privately.
Rex turned over the photos to a UFO researcher named Ann Druffel.
I would say that they are the most exciting and full of potential information that I have ever seen.
And Rex Heflin, after all these years, he's happy to know that there may finally be some finality. And he manages to keep a sense of humor, even as he wonders how those historic photos showed up in his mailbox. Have you seen any other UFOs since?
No.
How and when did you get...
Not even after 3 martinis.
There's the original front page.
Photos snapped within moments, taken here in the backyard of the Trent farm in McMinnville. The local newspaper sold thousands of copies across the country. Linda Saylor and Tammy Gokenauer remember their parents' account of what happened.
Mom was feeding the rabbits, saw something, hollered at Paul, and Dad's instinct was to go get the camera.
And then the saucer was gone.
For the alien family. That's all we were talked about, was the alien family.
When Paul and Evelyn Trent died in the mid-90s, the location of the negatives was a mystery. Linda Saylor discovered they had been in the hands of Navy physicist and UFO investigator Dr. Bruce Maccabee since 1974.
I contacted the Trents myself and talked to Mrs. Trent extensively over the few years. She said it was okay if I borrowed the negatives. And I implied that I was only going to keep them for a few weeks while I looked at them. Well, it became apparent that they had really good stuff in them, and it took me more than 2 weeks. I actually had the negatives for like 25 years.
Maccabee agreed to return the negatives to the Trent children. Case closed, right? Well, Linda thought it would be safer if Maccabee sent the negatives to the McMinnville News-Register to pass on to her. That was 2001, and she's been trying ever since to get the newspaper to give them back.
Hi, Mr. Bladine. This is Dan Tilkin with KATU Television calling you back again.
We wanted the newspaper to explain why it's keeping the negatives, but the publisher, Jeb Bladine, won't agree to an interview. So through these documents, we'll have to explain past arguments. His father, Phil, ran the paper when the photos were published. And this letter from 1970 shows Phil helped get the Trent's negatives on the flying saucer back from United Press International when they disappeared the first time. Phil Bladine is also the man who lent the negatives to Bruce Maccabee with the permission of Paul and Evelyn Trent 3 decades ago. The fact that Phil Bladine had them to lend is the crux of the newspaper's argument. In this letter to the family, Jeb Bladeen writes, Paul Trent left the negatives in Phil Bladeen's hands with the indication that he wanted nothing more to do with them. The letter states the paper believes that the negatives should become part of a permanent historic display in Yamhill County with a mediated settlement as to access and other rights. Even after Bruce Maccabee made it clear in this email he sent the negatives to Phil Bladeen under the assumption that he would return the photos to the Trent children. Then he clearly instructs, you should return them.
Trent's children are clearly the rightful owners. Since Mr. and Mrs. Trent never signed any document giving the rights to anyone else.
We went to the newspaper in person, and we were told Jeb Bladeen was in a meeting and he'd get back to us. Well, he did 6 days later. In this email, writing, it's possible there will be legal proceedings related to the UFO photographs, and I am not willing to participate in media interviews on the subject. We maintain our belief that the negatives should become part of a permanent historic display in Yamhill County.
We're not going to take them and try and make millions off them. We just want to put them like in a safety deposit box and have them locked up to where we know where they're at.
It's just something that belongs with the family. It doesn't say Jeb Bladeen photos. It doesn't say McMinnville Register photos. It says Paul Trent's photos.